Good morning or afternoon or maybe evening, everyone, depending on where you are. I'm Meryl Richards, the moderator for today's webinar on the Food Emissions 50 Company Benchmark, where we'll be discussing food companies' progress in disclosing emissions and setting targets. I'm a director of research on the Food and Forest team here at Ceres, which is a nonprofit organization working with the most influential capital market leaders to solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. Before we begin today's session, a few notes on logistics. First, as you just heard, this webinar is being recorded, and we'll be providing all participants with a link to the recording shortly after we finish. So if you have colleagues who wanted to join or you have to drop off early, you can always refer back to the recording. We will have time for an audience Q&A later in the agenda. So as you have questions during the webinar, feel free to pop them in the question and answer box at the bottom right hand of your screen, and we'll tackle those towards the end. If you have a technical question like trouble with audio, please also type that into the Q&A box and we will try to sort it out for you. So I want to thank each of you for participating in today's event, and I'm especially grateful to our speakers. We have with us today Nako Kobayashi and Thomas Peterson. Nako is a manager on the Food and Forest team here at Ceres, where she develops thought leadership on climate transition plans for the food sector and manages the Food Emissions 50 Company Benchmark. She most recently authored the Climate Action 100 Global Sector Strategy for the food and beverage sector. She holds an MS in Agriculture, Food and Environment from Tufts. Also with us is Thomas is from Green Century. He's a shareholder advocate, leveraging the funds and firm's clout as a shareholder to drive companies to adopt more environmentally sustainable policies and practices. Thomas leads Green Century's engagements on forests and on upstream greenhouse gas emissions related to food and agriculture. His comments have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, Investment News, Responsible Investor, and on CBS Mornings, and he holds a BA from Harvard. So thank you, Nako and Thomas, for joining us. This webinar is part of Ceres Food Emissions 50 initiative. As you probably know if you're joining us, Food Emissions 50 is an investor-led initiative to accelerate progress on climate change in the food sector. By engaging 50 of the highest emitting public food companies in North America, investors are seeking to move companies to improve their greenhouse gas emissions disclosures, set ambitious emission reduction targets, and implement even more ambitious climate transition action plans that are in line with the goals of the Paris Agreement. One component of this initiative, which you'll be hearing about today, is a public benchmark of company performance on disclosures, targets, and eventually transition action plans. Ceres launched the benchmark in July of 2021, and just 2 days ago, updated the benchmark to reflect company progress since that point. So Nako will start us off by reviewing how companies have improved performance on the benchmark since July. Then we'll hear from Thomas. Green Century is a signatory of Food Emissions 50, and Thomas will talk about Green Century's approach to engagement with food companies and what actions investors expect from the sector in the coming year. Before we get started, I'd like to note that an integral part of our discussion today is the role that natural and working lands from where our food comes play in mitigating climate change. So I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territories of all Native and Indigenous peoples, both in the US and globally, who've stewarded these lands for generations with attention to both people and the environment. We do this to affirm our commitment to recognize and respect the rights of Indigenous people around the world, including through our own work. With that said, I'll now turn it over to Nako to update us on company movement on the Food Emissions 50 benchmark.
Thanks, Meryl, for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here with us today. So as Meryl mentioned, Food Emissions 50, the benchmark, is a part of the Food Emissions 50 campaign, and it's really a benchmark that is intended to guide investor engagements with companies so that investors know sort of where a snapshot idea of where companies are at in setting greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets and also disclosing their full scope of emissions. Next slide, please. So the reason why we launched this campaign is really because the global food system is responsible for approximately a third of all greenhouse gas emissions. And a lot of these emissions are embedded within the production of key agricultural commodities. And for companies in this sector, they often fall under scope 3 or indirect emissions from the supply chain. So as a refresher, scope 1 emissions are the direct emissions that companies have direct control over. Scope 2 emissions are emissions associated with the purchased electricity. And scope 3 emissions are these other emissions that, span the gamut of employee travel to waste disposal, and then also purchase goods and services, which includes the procurement of raw agricultural commodities and also the land use change that, is embedded within those procurement purchases. And many companies are failing to measure and disclose their scope 3 emissions, which can lead to a lot of underreporting of emissions and also unambitious targets that only cover a fraction of the company's full scope climate impact. Next slide, please. So in order to drive change in this sector, we launched the Food Emissions 50 benchmark, and this slide shows the companies that are tracked within this initiative. We wanted to really get at the 50 of the highest emitting greenhouse gas emitters in the North American food sector, focusing on publicly listed companies that are headquartered in the US, Canada, or Mexico. But as I just mentioned, scope 3 disclosures are really limited. And so it was really impossible to kind of to be able to base this list directly on, companies' greenhouse gas emissions profiles, just because of that data unavailability. So instead, we used a few proxies to estimate which companies we thought, would fit our criteria of being publicly listed, being in North America, and then also trying to hit the largest greenhouse gas emitters. So first, we focused our attention to these 6 industries, sub-industries within the global industry classification standard definitions. So agricultural products companies, commonly referred to as agricultural commodity traders, packaged foods and meats companies, food distributors, food retailers, hypermarkets and supercenters, which are similar to food retailers, but more of the big box stores, and restaurants. And after we narrowed it down to these sub-industries, we then looked at companies with a market cap of around 6 billion or higher to try and estimate the influence that we felt those companies would have over the larger sector. And you notice that in some sub-industries like agricultural products, food distributors, there are fewer companies just because they make up a larger portion of the market cap in those sub-industries. So those are a little bit more highly concentrated sub-industries. And then finally, to try and estimate the greenhouse gas emissions footprint, we narrowed our list even further by focusing on companies with exposure to the highest emitting agricultural commodities globally based on some peer-reviewed studies. And so these commodities included beef, cattle milk, rice, soybeans, pork, poultry, eggs, palm oil, and wheat. And we measured exposure based on companies' product mix as well as public disclosures of commodity sourcing. Next slide, please. And so with that context, I'd like to dive into some of the findings that we found in our benchmark results. And along with that, I'll also explain a little bit about the indicators we were tracking and why. So the first indicator that we tracked in this benchmark is whether companies were disclosing their scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services, and whether it was clear in those emissions disclosures that emissions from agriculture and land use change were being included. So we found that of our 50 benchmark companies, only 23 disclosed scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services at all, and a very limited number were making it clear that land use change emissions were being included. And we know that, if companies are reporting their scope 3 emissions according to the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, for example, it is recommended that companies are including agriculture and land use change emissions as a part of these disclosures. However, according to some research that was done by the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, they found that unless companies were reporting their land-based emissions under scope 1 emissions for the agricultural lands that they own and operate, for many downstream companies, they were failing to report the emissions from agriculture and land use change unless explicitly mentioned in their calculation methodology. And this could be because companies may simply not know whether the databases and estimates that they're using to calculate their Scope 3 emissions include agriculture and land use change emissions, or that they are, omitting it for another reason. But we found that very few companies are kind of holistically and comprehensively disclosing these emissions. And this is an issue because over 90% of emissions from Scope 3 for a lot of these food companies are embedded within their purchased goods and services. And for some companies that have disclosed a breakdown of all of their emission sources, some companies have found that 40% or more of their full scope, so scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions, 40% of those can actually come from land use change alone. So that's a pretty significant underreporting. If companies are failing to report, for example, the emissions associated with the deforestation that might have occurred to expand land to produce like the soybeans that are in their supply chain. So this could be a pretty significant underestimate of a company's emissions. And this could lead to, prioritizing the wrong things within plans to address their climate impact. Next slide, please. And then the second indicator we were looking at is emissions reductions targets, and specifically whether those targets are covering Scope 3. So similarly to disclosure, if companies are not setting targets to reduce their Scope 3 emissions, they're going to be setting targets that omit a large portion of their emissions. And so we found that 21 companies have general, any kind of greenhouse gas emissions reductions target that has Scope 3 emissions included. And only 13 of those are science-based targets that are validated by the Science Based Targets Initiative to be aligned with a 1.5 or well below 2-degree scenario. And so, we would like to see more companies setting targets that really cover these emissions that encompass the majority of their full scope of emissions. Next slide, please. And so, as Meryl mentioned, we first launched this benchmark in July, and the results I just explained were from this time around. So for data up to January of 2022. And, although I highlighted that there's a lot of progress that needs to be made, I think we would be remiss to not talk about the progress that has been made since we first launched the benchmark. And so you'll see here a table with the company movement that's been made. So 13 companies between July and January of 2022, either 13 companies took 21 actions to improve their emissions disclosures or improve their targets. And as you can see in this table, in the bottom two rows, we saw the most movement in companies setting greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets that cover their Scope 3 emissions. And I'll note that some companies went ahead and set their 1.5 or well below 2-degree science-based targets, but some of the other companies that set a new target with Scope 3 have committed to setting a science-based target. They just have not been validated fully by the Science Based Targets Initiative yet. Next slide, please. And so when you look at it by company level, you'll see all the different companies that made progress between the 6 months. And again, you'll note that most of the movement happened with the greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets, with 10 new companies setting targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, inclusive of Scope 3 emissions. And to highlight a couple companies, Aramark is one company that previously did not report any Scope 3 emissions and now discloses their Scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services and makes it clear within their emissions calculation methodology that agriculture is being included in their Scope 3 disclosure. So this is definitely a promising sign. And you'll notice that several other companies like J.M. Smucker and United Natural Foods and Walmart also made it clear within their emissions calculation methodology this time around in their CDP reporting that their Scope 3 disclosures include emissions from agriculture. Next slide, please. And so now I want to quickly run through kind of the sub-industry level comparisons on the trends that we're seeing between different sub-industries and the movement. And so you'll find that there are clear leaders and laggards in this space. So in terms of emissions disclosures, Most companies still lack comprehensive Scope 3 disclosures. So even among the agricultural products companies, although the majority of those companies, and remember that there are only 4 of those companies on our list due to market concentration in that sub-industry, but the majority of those companies do have some Scope 3 emissions disclosures, but none of them clearly include agricultural land use change. And then we see here that food retail is a clear laggard. Next slide, please. And then in terms of emissions reductions targets, we'll also see kind of similar companies up at the top. So restaurants and agricultural products, again, are kind of leading in this space, with food retail still being a key laggard. And we'll see that more and more companies are setting a target with Scope 3 emissions, but very few still have those science-based targets that we wanted to see that are aligned with 1.5 and 2 degree scenarios. And I think what this slide also shows is that, there are clear laggards in this space, and, we are getting to the point where, ambitious and urgent climate action is needed. And it's very hard to expect companies to be able to take robust and ambitious actions if they're not even setting targets that cover the majority of their emissions. So a lot of the companies that don't have any targets or only have targets for their Scope 1 and 2 emissions are really not going to be mitigating their climate risk in line with, a 1.5 C scenario. The next slide, please. And so just to highlight one of the sub-industries that you saw kind of at the top of both of those graphs that I just showed is restaurants. So this was actually the most improved sub-industry from last time around. 4 companies out of the 13 total were in this sub-industry that improved their disclosures and targets. And like I noted before, there are some companies that have set a Scope 3 inclusive target, but they're still waiting on SBTi validation. So in terms of disclosure of purchased goods and services emissions, previously 7 companies had disclosed these emissions, and now 10 companies are doing it. So 3 new companies are disclosing the purchased goods and services. And in terms of targets, previously 6 companies had any target inclusive of Scope 3 emissions, and now 10 companies do. So this is also promising. And of these, 3 of them were science-based targets that were validated for well below 2 or 1.5 C scenario. And there are a few companies that, are just waiting on that SBTi validation. And I think, the restaurant industry is a really interesting one because we do see that some other downstream sub-industries, such as, food retailers, are clear laggards. And one of the common, challenges that those companies face is assessing their full scope emissions because they have very long, complex supply chains being at the downstream end of the supply chain. But we see that, it is possible for downstream companies like restaurants to really, start assessing more comprehensively their full scope of emissions and also setting targets and recognizing the importance of owning those emissions as their own and setting targets to reduce them. So I think that restaurants could be an example for some of the other downstream companies that are lagging in this space. Next slide, please. Which leads me to then talk about the clear laggard on our benchmark list, which is the food retail companies. And so we found that on both the greenhouse gas inventory side and the emissions reductions targets, none of the companies on our list had, anything that met our indicators. And I think, Thomas will talk about this a little bit more in his slides and in the Q&A section to follow. But I think there are real challenges to be addressed moving forward in this sub-industry. And so with that, I'll turn it over back to Meryl, but happy to take any questions at the end of this session on any of the findings that we just presented.
Thanks so much, Nako. It's exciting to see the progress being made, but as you said, there's also clearly a long way to go. So to tackle some of those challenges, we'll now transition to Thomas Peterson to discuss Green Century's approach to engagement with Food Emissions 50 focused companies and companies in the food sector generally.
Great. Thanks very much, Meryl, and very nice to be here with you all. And thank you, Naka, for that presentation of the updated benchmark. I'm just going to briefly introduce Green Century, our approach to shareholder advocacy, and our approach to these issues. So we can jump to the next slide for just a brief overview of who we are. Green Century Capital Management is the investment advisor to the Green Century Funds, which are the first family of fossil fuel-free, responsible, and diversified mutual funds in the US. We were founded back in 1991, based in Boston. We have a shareholder advocacy program, and we're also the only US mutual fund company owned by nonprofit, environmental, and public health organizations. And we see a three-pronged approach to our impact in terms of making positive environmental change, addressing environmental risks at the systemic and company-specific level. So in terms of our investment approach, our funds choose companies with high environmental, social, and governance ratings. And they also exclude coal, oil, and gas exploration, extraction, refining, processing, and transportation, and fossil fuel burning utility companies. So the funds are entirely fossil fuel free. So that's the investment prong. Then comes the advocacy prong. So we engaged over 130 companies last year in our shareholder advocacy program to secure measurable concrete changes in supply chains and operations around deforestation, plastics, emissions, and a couple of other areas that we work on. And then finally, when it comes to our ownership, we're wholly owned by environmental nonprofits, which means that 100% of our net profits can be used to advance policy on the same issues that we work on. So that supports work to protect pollinators, promote renewable energy, and preserve public lands. And next slide, I'll cover our approach to shareholder advocacy. So we view it as our role to educate companies on changing consumer preferences and the business risks they face related to the environmental issues we work on. We provide examples of best practice policies, what we see as the best actions they can take to respond to these risks. And then when necessary, we file shareholder resolutions to elevate the issue at the company and leverage our power to make change. We then negotiate with companies to set meaningful policies with implementation deadlines. We want to work with companies not to set aspirational goals that aren't going to be achieved, but to be able to make real change. And next slide, I will talk about our approach to some of these issues. Yes, so our work on the Food Emissions 50 integrates our work on curbing climate change and our longstanding work on forest protection and addressing deforestation risk. And if we look to the next slide, I'll talk a little bit more about the history of that work. So Green Century has been engaging companies on forest risk for nearly a decade now. We've been one of the leading US-based investors on this issue, and it's resulted in numerous significant no deforestation policies from the companies that we engage with. And the beginning of our engagement on this issue focused on palm oil, which of course is a major driver of deforestation, primarily in Southeast Asia. And over the course of nearly a decade of work on this issue now, we've negotiated no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation policies, which are considered the best practice approach to forest risk when it comes to palm oil at major companies in the sector, and pushed companies to achieve 100% Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil certified palm oil for what they're sourcing. And made other progress in the palm oil space, where there's been significant improvement. And over the last couple of years, as the focus has really shifted to Latin America with skyrocketing deforestation and conversion rates there, we've shifted focus to the soy value chain. Soy, of course, is a major commodity driver of deforestation in Latin America. And that's sort of the broad history of our work on deforestation. We're the filers of the first deforestation proposals to receive majority votes in the US. And I actually think the only proposals that have received majority votes on deforestation have been filed by us. Some notable ones there. In the fall of 2020, we filed a proposal at Procter & Gamble focused on both their palm oil supply chain and wood pulp sourcing. That received the first majority vote for a deforestation-related proposal. Another that I would highlight, last spring at Bunge, we had filed a proposal related to native vegetation conversion in their soy supply chain, focused primarily on the Cerrado region of Brazil, and management ended up supporting that proposal. And so it achieved a record 99% support from shareholders, calling on the company to address this forest risk issue. So that's our history when it comes to deforestation. We've also been engaging companies directly on emissions. for a long time. And we see the Food Emissions 50 campaign as a place where these two engagements, so forest risk engagements and climate risk engagements, overlap for us, because we know that we cannot limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius without ending deforestation this decade. That's becoming clearer and clearer, and is becoming more urgent as tropical deforestation continues to accelerate in places like Brazil. We also know that the food system accounts for 1/3 of all anthropogenic emissions, as Nako mentioned, and a lot of those emissions are driven by deforestation and native vegetation conversion and other land uses. So for that reason, and for the fact that for most food companies, the overwhelming bulk of their emissions fall under scope 3 and are related to agriculture and land use change, it makes a lot of sense for us to engage on the topics that Ceres has outlined in the Food Emissions 50 benchmark. And if we go to the next slide, I'll talk about a particular example of how we've done this. So we've had a longstanding engagement with Costco. Our engagement with them began in 2018, focused on supply chain deforestation. We were initially focused on cattle, which is, of course, the largest commodity driver of deforestation. Since then, our engagement with Costco has broadened to include other commodity drivers of deforestation, and in the last year has continued to incorporate those concerns, but shifted focus to scope 3 emissions as well. So Costco at the beginning, this summer when Ceres first published this benchmark, did not meet any of the Food Emissions 50 benchmarks, and we were concerned they also lagged many of their peers on these areas. So they were not disclosing scope 3 emissions at all, and they had not set targets for any of their scopes of emissions, scopes 1, 2, and 3. And while there was a timeline for setting scopes 1 and 2 targets, they had not set a timeline for setting targets for scope 3, which we know represent the vast bulk of their emissions. For context, Walmart, one of their chief competitors, discloses that scope 3 emissions represent 95% of its total climate impact. So we knew that scope 3 was a major area of concern for Costco in terms of its climate impact, and we were seeing lagging action compared to some of its peers. So we filed a shareholder proposal calling on the company to set science-based targets aligned with achieving net zero emissions by 2050 and covering emissions from its full value chain. So scopes 1, 2, and 3. We had a dialogue with the company regarding these risks, but we felt that they were not moving fast enough, both to ensure that there was a high level of ambition for the targets that they would be setting, that they'd be aligned with these globally accepted benchmarks of achieving substantial reductions by 2030 and achieving net zero emissions by 2050, or that they'd be aligned with a 1.5 degree scenario. And we were also concerned about the lagging timeline on scope 3. So no scope 3 disclosure yet, and no clear timeline for setting targets for this vast majority of their emissions. So we were concerned about these risks, and our proposal ended up going to a vote at their annual meeting of shareholders last month, so in January. And at that meeting, 70% of voting Costco shareholders supported our proposal, calling on the company to set these science-based targets. And so we're very hopeful now that management will accelerate its efforts, particularly related to reducing scope 3 emissions, something that some of its peers have been engaged in for nearly 5 years now. So that's an example of one way that we've approached the Food Emissions 50 benchmark. And I'll note one other thing here related to this engagement is that we've continued to emphasize the importance of addressing deforestation and achieving deforestation-free supply chains for forest risk commodities as a necessary piece of scope 3 emissions reduction, given the high emissions impact that commodity-driven deforestation has. And I'll wrap up there for this sort of initial introduction to our work and to our approach to these issues, and turn it back over to Meryl.
Thanks so much, Thomas. That was a great introduction. So to dive a little bit deeper, what we saw from the presentation on the benchmark was that while more companies are beginning to set greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and disclose scope 3 emissions from purchased goods and services, disclosures that explicitly include land-based emissions from agriculture and land use change are still lagging behind. And you touched on this a little bit, but could you speak to why consistent and accurate disclosure on these topics is so important for Green Century?
Absolutely. So I think for us, absent disclosures like this that are consistent and comprehensive, it's very difficult to assess companies' exposure to climate risk, and also to easily compare progress and identify ESG leaders and laggards, which is a core part of what we're looking to do. So as it currently stands, we need to parse through each scope 3 category and determine where companies are reporting. And that is only possible when companies are reporting to CDP or otherwise issuing these in-depth disclosures. And then even within categories, determining where that reporting is comprehensive and externally validated. And so for companies that aspire to lead on ESG, we view comprehensive scope 3 emissions disclosure as necessary. And then within that, for food companies, it's obviously very important to report on purchased goods and services, as of course, that's the category that represents the vast bulk of those emissions. But absent clarification on whether that purchased goods and services disclosure or estimate includes agriculture and land use change, it's very difficult for us to understand how comprehensive it is, since those can contribute such great portions to the emissions of companies in this sector. If we don't know if those are being accounted for in the disclosures, our comparisons company to company can't amount to all that much, right? If they might be missing, something that could be equivalent to, 20% or so of their total purchased goods and services emissions. So I think that's why we see comprehensive disclosure is so important here.
So turning to targets then, and Nako showed us that since July, we've had 8 companies that have set new greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. 5 of those have set 1.5 degree or well below 2 degrees C aligned science-based targets. And some companies have said that, they haven't set their target yet, but they're committing to set SBTi validated targets in the coming year. Now, the Science-Based Targets Initiative will soon have guidance that companies can use to set 1.5 C-line targets for emissions from forest, land, and agriculture, which I know you've reiterated several times are so important. Knowing this guidance is coming out, how will it change your expectations of companies in the coming years, including companies that perhaps have recently set science-based targets?
Absolutely. So we will expect that companies in relevant sectors set these forest, land, and agriculture or flag targets with SBTi as well. And so the draft guidance from SBTi indicates that the sectors that will require flag targets are forest and paper products, food production, and food and beverage processing, and food and staples retailing, and also for tobacco. So for any companies in those sectors, we will be expecting them to set flag targets. And the other thing that I think is interesting in the SBTi guidance here is that for companies that fall outside of those designated sectors, but that have more than 20% of revenues coming from forest, land, or agriculture, or have more than 20% of overall emissions coming from those areas, those companies will be expected to set targets as well, using this new flag guidance. And so I think we would align with that expectation. We would expect that companies set those targets. And for companies that are setting their first targets, they should set flag targets. And for companies that are renewing or updating their targets, when that time comes, they should add that on to their target setting. And I think the other thing that I would want to highlight here is that at this point, we expect that companies set 1.5 degree aligned targets rather than 2 degree aligned targets. It's clear that the international community is coalescing around this high ambition goal. And we also know that the physical risks, so risks impacting the whole food value chain, dramatically increase in the margin between 1.5 and 2 degrees of warming, according to the IPCC's work on this issue. So dramatic increases in the impact of heat waves, droughts, flooding, food shortages, et cetera, in that gap between 1.5 and 2. So I think that's the other piece that we would really underline there around our expectations.
So I know, one thing we sometimes hear from companies is they feel like the expectations are always changing. It was 2 degrees, now it's 1.5, now you need a flag target. How do you communicate the importance of adapting to this rising level of ambition in your engagements with companies?
Yeah, I think the thing that we would really want to underline there is that it's not sort of an arbitrary thing that the expectations are rising, right? It's responding to physical realities in the world. And so companies need to understand that the pace of action to address these risks is not going to be linear, and that the longer that companies wait to take action, the more aggressive that action will need to be, because the risks are escalating. And as the science is refined and expectations rise, companies that proactively are addressing food emissions, and those that have for years now, will be better positioned to take advantage of opportunities in the space, and also to mitigate risks. Whereas it'll be increasingly difficult for laggards to catch up. So that's why we view it as so important that companies be taking action on this now, because as expectations rise, it will be more and more difficult for companies to stay competitive.
Thanks. So turning to some more specific examples, you already spoke about your engagement with Costco. Are there other recent company movements in particular that you find really encouraging?
Yes, definitely. And I should say, because I think I left it out when I spoke about Costco earlier, that we've seen some improvements already in their approach here. So they have now committed to disclosing emissions from purchased goods and services at the end of this year, developing a Scope 3 action plan, and eventual Scope 3 targets sometime in the next couple of years. And then they also set their initial Scope 1 and 2 target estimates this January, so a year earlier than planned. So we've seen some accelerated action there, which we applaud. That's the kind of response we want to see from companies that are taking these risks more seriously. I think some other developments that we see as encouraging. It's good to see initial Scope 3 targets set this past fall by both ADM and Bunge. I think we would want to be sure that we've been engaging both of them on deforestation for a long time, and we want to be sure that their deforestation and native vegetation conversion goals make the achievement of those Scope 3 targets possible. And both could increase the level of ambition to align with 1.5 degrees, but still, Scope 3 targets for major agricultural commodity traders like those companies is a major step forward, and good to see. We also think it's promising to see Sysco become the first of the food distributors to set a target covering Scope 3. We think it's important to show leadership in a sub-industry that has been lagging. And then, of course, Nako highlighted the really impressive developments in the restaurant sub-industry. So we definitely want to call that out as well as a few promising developments among packaged foods. Kraft Heinz and Smucker are both setting targets this past fall. So I think those are a couple of the promising developments we've seen quite recently.
And given some of those, and also the vote at Costco that you spoke to earlier, how do you think investors' expectations have changed in recent years regarding food companies' disclosure and target setting for Scope 3 emissions, especially from purchased goods and services?
Absolutely. So I think we're perhaps seeing this spring a bit of a sea change. So investors coalescing around the idea that food companies should be setting targets that cover Scope 3. So I think one thing that I would call out here is the Wall Street Journal headline covering the vote at Costco was Costco shareholder vote signals focus on supply chain emissions. And I think that gets it exactly right. That I think there's increasing understanding across investors that the food system is very high emitting, right? That we know that the food system accounts for roughly a third of all emissions. And that means that major food companies need to be taking action here. And since the emissions are so heavily concentrated in Scope 3, that means that Scope 3 disclosures and Scope 3 targets are necessary if we're going to address these risks. And I think the other thing that I'd note is that it's not just investors. So the SEC is considering disclosure requirements. And then there's also a bill moving in the California state legislature that would require companies starting at a certain size to disclose their Scope 3 emissions. So I think I don't imagine that we're sort of headed in the other direction anytime soon, that I think that we're moving towards Scope 3 disclosures and target setting being the general expectation of investors.
Thanks. I think we actually had a question about the SEC coming through in the chat, so maybe we'll get to that a little later. In terms of laggards, so as Nako mentioned earlier, and you also highlighted, the food retail sub-industry is a pretty clear laggard. What are some of the challenges you faced engaging companies in this sub-industry, and what are your expectations for food retail companies going forward?
Definitely. And we definitely have seen lagging action in this space. Although I think it's important to note that there are some major food retailers or retailers that sell food as part of their business that have made good progress on Scope 3 emissions and target setting. So Walmart has been working on this for a long time now. Ahold Delhaize has set science-based targets as well, which obviously isn't in the scope of this, as it's not a US-based company, but it's certainly possible for companies in this space to be taking action there. One challenge that we heard from Costco is the large and rapidly shifting supplier base. And we acknowledge that that's a challenge for retailers to get their arms around when it comes to tackling Scope 3 emissions. But we were also concerned that the company didn't consider itself to have much control over these emissions. And we think that approach has to change because we know that some retailers have been engaging with suppliers to address Scope 3 emissions for 5 years now. And so clearly retailers do have leverage and can make a real impact on their supply chain emissions by setting targets, proactively engaging with suppliers, expecting disclosures from suppliers. So we think that work there is certainly possible. And going forward, we would expect food retailers to align with the SBTi guidance and set 1.5 degree aligned flag targets, as well as their general targets, and to disclose those emissions from agriculture and land use change.
Thanks. And related to emissions from land use change, you talked a little bit earlier about how deforestation fits into your climate-related engagements. Why is it so important for Green Century that companies are addressing their deforestation risk as a way to manage their climate-related risk?
Absolutely. And I think I didn't fully go into how we understand deforestation risks. So I'll do that a little bit now. And deforestation has been at the center of our advocacy work for nearly a decade now, as I mentioned. And in addition to the evident biodiversity and human rights impacts of deforestation, its negative impacts on agriculture through soil degradation and increased droughts and flooding, and of course, the contribution of deforestation to zoonotic disease spread and the importance of stopping deforestation to pandemic resilience in future. Deforestation is, of course, among the most significant contributors to climate change, second only to the burning of fossil fuels, essentially, in terms of contributors to warming. And then when it comes to physical risks, deforestation exacerbates climate risk, so contributing to declining crop yields, floods, and droughts, and therefore disrupted supply chains and increased commodity prices. And so food companies should be addressing these deforestation and climate risks in conjunction, as they're mutually reinforcing, essentially. So deforestation makes climate change worse. Climate change worsens the deforestation-related physical risks. So ridding supply chains of deforestation is really important for addressing those risks and also addressing companies' climate impacts. And then, of course, we know that deforestation and land use change makes up a sizable percentage of emissions from the food system generally. And so food companies need to be addressing those emissions. And I think the one other thing that I would highlight here is that the latest research indicates that deforestation must end by 2025 if we're to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. And so if we're going to keep the ambitious high-level climate goals in the realm of possibility, really rapid action needs to occur to end deforestation. And of course, tropical deforestation is primarily driven by demand for agricultural commodities. So it's a food system issue to address this. And it's critical for keeping our climate goals in the realm of possibility.
Thanks, Thomas. So we've got a ton of questions coming into the Q&A. So I'm going to ask one more question of my own and then open it up for audience Q&A.
Great.
So what about the leaders? What are your expectations for the leaders on the benchmark who, are disclosing their full scope of emissions, including land-based emissions, and already have ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets? What do you expect from them?
Yeah, so I think the next step after the disclosure and the target setting is to develop, disclose, and execute on high quality transition plans that will make their reduction goals possible. And we defer in a lot of ways to Ceres' expertise in studying these and crafting guidance for the development of them. But pieces that we know to be really important are ensuring supply chain traceability, so an understanding of what's there in the supply chain from an emissions perspective, from a deforestation perspective, and then achieving no deforestation and no conversion supply chains, and then integrating these climate goals at the high level into corporate decision-making, incentivizing emissions reduction, partnering with suppliers, and then aligning capital expenditures, project development, research and development with these climate goals such that they can be achievable.
Thanks so much, Thomas. Okay, so let's bring Nako back on screen as well, and I will dig into some of the Q&A. So we actually have a question that meshes fairly nicely with what Thomas was just talking about, which is how do the disclosure and target setting asks of the FE50 benchmark fit into climate transition plans? I don't know if Nako, you want to tackle that one?
Sure, yeah, that is a great question. And I think the purpose for starting off this benchmark with the indicators that we did, so the target setting and the disclosures, is that we really want to see climate transition plans that are grounded in ambitious targets and, based in a comprehensive understanding of full scope emissions. So we wouldn't prefer to see climate transition plans that, get a company to set goals to achieve like a 2-degree scenario. For example, we know with the climate science that's out there now that we really need more ambitious asks. So that is one of the reasons why we would look for companies to first set, an ambitious target and then have a plan to achieve that target. And similarly for the Scope 3 disclosures, companies will be unable to create plans that really address the major sources of their emissions if they do not know what the major source of their emissions are and where they're coming from. So it's really important that companies start to have a better understanding of, how much of their emissions are coming from different parts of their supply chain so that they can target, the actions and interventions they take appropriately.
Thanks, Nako. So we've got another question about retailers. So many companies seem eager to set climate goals, even if they don't know exactly how to achieve them. Thus, it's telling that retailers are hesitant to set Scope 3 targets. What are the reasons they are hesitant? And maybe, Thomas, you can tackle this one based on your engagements. Is it because they don't see how they can influence those far removed upstream emissions? Do they see it as their supplier's responsibility? Also, what about the other material Scope 3 emissions that retailers largely ignore, like customers driving to their stores?
Definitely. I'll address that. So the question lays out some of the major challenges that retailers see. So I think they view it as a lack of ability to control those emissions or not sure how to engage suppliers towards addressing those emissions goals. I think one thing that I will say is that those other Scope 3 categories are really pale in comparison to the impact of purchased goods and services. So that is where the attention should be specifically for food retailers. For other kinds of retailers, like DIY retailers that sell, high emitting products, maybe there should be focus on use of sold products. But for retailers that are primarily food retailers, the focus has to be on purchased goods and services, that most of the other categories, make up a couple percentage points essentially of their Scope 3 emissions. So that's where the focus should be. In terms of engaging suppliers, we've seen some approaches among retailers where they've committed to getting X% of their suppliers by spend to set science-based targets by a certain deadline. So they have set a goal for themselves around supplier engagement as a means of approaching this, and expecting that suppliers who they're making major purchases from have those targets in place by a certain deadline is one approach there. I also saw something in the chat about an initial focus on private label products. I think obviously that makes sense as a first place to start for retailers, right? It's the part of their portfolio where they have the most control. And so focusing on emissions reductions there first can be a way to take a big bite out of Scope 3 emissions in a way that's more in their direct control. So prioritizing that first, setting goals around where suppliers are going to be in terms of their own target setting by a certain date. Those are some of the initial approaches that we've seen companies take to addressing Scope 3 among retailers.
Great, thanks, Thomas. So we've got one comment just that they were both excellent presentations, which I would have to agree with. Someone's asking, Thomas, congratulations to Green Century for such an impressive vote result at Costco. What do you think led to that success?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing increased awareness from major investors that food is very high emitting, that the food system is very high emitting, and that companies across all sectors, but of course, Costco also sells things that aren't food. The companies across all sectors need to be setting targets like this, right? That it's not only oil and gas companies that need to be setting climate targets, that all major companies in their portfolios, big investors are now expecting them to set science-based targets. So we saw at the COP meeting this fall, major financial institutions signing on to the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And so I think now companies or big asset managers are aligning their proxy voting with the goals that they have set for their investment portfolios to achieve net zero. If the big companies that they're holding aren't working towards those goals, the investment portfolios are not going to get there either. So this is one of the ways that big asset managers are sort of operationalizing those goals.
Great, thanks. So we've got a couple questions coming in about specific sub-industries. And I'll leave this open as to whether Nako or Thomas or both want to tackle it. Is there an opportunity for food retailers to use their private label offerings to accelerate Scope 3 reductions?
Yeah, so I think Thomas spoke to this a little bit, but just to elaborate a little bit more, another trend we're seeing in the markets is that a lot of food retailers and some other companies are engaging in backward integration, which is a form of vertical integration where some companies are starting to acquire, companies upstream in their supply chains and maybe, have more control over those agricultural production practices than they would have otherwise if they had just been sourcing from third-party suppliers. So I think this is an interesting trend where more companies may have a little bit more control. Their second tier, third tier suppliers now become their direct suppliers. And so they have a little bit more leverage to engage those suppliers directly and, perhaps ask them to set science-based targets themselves and that kind of thing. So I think that this kind of trend does create more space for companies to have more leverage over their suppliers. But I think it's also important to note that we'd like to see climate action not just specific to private label brands or specific segments of their portfolio. We really want to see targets and disclosures that are comprehensive across an entire portfolio, so not just specific brands. And that also goes to when companies start creating their transition plans, that we would like to see actions that are really comprehensive and are not just targeted towards specific parts of the supply chain or specific brands within a company's portfolio.
Thanks, Nako. Thomas, do you want to elaborate on that, or I've got another question about?
I think Nako covered it there in my initial comments, or add anything else that I would want to add.
Great, thanks. So we've got another question about fast food companies, which is just curious what the biggest challenges have been for fast food companies. I don't know if Thomas, you want to start with this one, and then Nako, you can layer in.
So I'll say that we haven't been directly engaging any fast food companies as part of this campaign, so I might not be best to speak to it.
I think one thing that we see often from fast food companies is that their business models just have a lot of franchisees, and a lot of restaurants, are not entirely certain how much control they might have over their franchisees. Some may not feel responsible for the emissions from those franchises, but I think it's important to note that those still fall under Scope 3 emissions for these companies and that they should be addressing them as their own emissions. And I think it's promising to see a lot of these fast food companies setting targets that are comprehensive. And it'll be interesting to see how, moving forward, they seek to address their franchise emissions as a part of their overall actions to meet their targets. Because if they're setting targets inclusive of Scope 3, that will cover franchises.
Thanks, Nako. So I'll do a couple more questions, then we'll need to wrap up. Thank you to all of our attendees for such fantastic questions. We won't be able to get to all of them, but hopefully we can get through a few. Is there an inherent plan for reducing emissions that comes along with reporting of emissions? Nako, do you want to tackle this one?
So I think that's where we're starting to hear, investors asking for climate transition plans. Before, companies could just set a target and not really disclose that much other information. So we saw this a lot with deforestation commitments, where a lot of companies set commitments to, achieve deforestation-free supply chains by 2020, But because very few companies laid out an action plan to eliminate deforestation from their supply chains, few companies achieved those targets by 2020, and there's still, deforestation in their supply chain. So I think that's part of the reason why there is this push for transition plans. So after companies set targets, I think Thomas could probably speak to this, but investors are asking companies to then disclose an action plan or a roadmap or whatever you might call it that outlines the steps that companies expect to take with interim targets that are quantifiable and measurable along the way to achieving, a 2030 or 2040 emissions reductions target in the long term.
Thanks, Nako. So one last question. Thomas, you mentioned new SEC disclosure roles. So this question is, what roles do the SEC and other regulatory bodies play in this? And with multinational companies, how might standards be applied?
Right. So initially, the SEC rules on this were expected the end of this year, and I think, or the end of last year, and now we're expecting them sometime this spring. And it seems likely that Scope 1 and 2 disclosures will be required. And I think it's still a subject of live debate whether Scope 3 disclosures will be required or not. Although it does seem like, at least for companies doing business in California, which many of the companies on the benchmark are doing, there will be state level policy requiring Scope 3 disclosure soon. So it remains to be seen what the SEC will do there. But I think as we've laid out, Scope 3 disclosure is incredibly important for assessing climate risk. I think one other thing that I would note here, a recent research update from PRI, the Principles for Responsible Investment, noted that while Scope 1 and 2 emissions for US-based firms are dropping, Scope 3 emissions are increasing almost as a mirror to that reduction in Scope 1 and 2. So there's a concern that companies may be outsourcing their emissions to Scope 3 functionally, and that, from a climate risk perspective, doesn't do anyone any good. So that's why it's so important that Scope 3 disclosures be part of this. And we hope that the SEC will take action to mandate that. I'm sorry, was there another part of the question that I missed there?
No, you've got it. The
Okay.
rest of the question was how it would apply to multinational companies.
I mean, in other, national jurisdictions, there are other actions in progress to work on disclosure in these areas, right? The EU tends to be moving faster ahead than the US in terms of mandating sustainability disclosures. So, depending on where companies are domiciled, they'll be making some kinds of, or they'll be subject to some kinds of reporting requirements.
Great. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much. And thanks also to our audience for the great questions. Please note that you'll all receive a follow-up email with the recording of this session shortly, so you can share it with colleagues or look back on it if you had to miss part. If you want to learn more about the Food Emissions 50 and the benchmark, I'm putting the link into the chat so you can see that address. For those interested in taking the next step, Ceres coordinates a number of networks and initiatives like Food Emissions 50 that offer investors the opportunity to collaborate on climate change and deforestation and other issues. So feel free to contact the Food and Forest team at the email address that I'm putting into the chat, which is ffinvestorengagement@ceres.org, and we'd be happy to connect with you. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.